This Ultimate Ryzen PC Build Guide 2025 video is a supercut of all of our 2025 PC build advice on CPU and GPU combos, motherboards, coolers, SSDs, RAM, PSUs, and PC cases with just a focus on the best components for a Ryzen PC build in 2025. Whether you're looking to do a budget gaming PC build with a Ryzen 5600X, a mid-range gaming PC with a Ryzen 7000 or 9000 series CPU, or a high-end gaming PC with a Ryzen X3D CPU like the 9800X 3D or 7800X 3D, this video is for you. If you want a deeper dive on any of these topics, I've linked the full 2025 component guides down in the video description, and there are individual CPU build guides for the Ryzen 7600X, 9600X, 9950X, 7800X 3D, and 9800X 3D as well. When you're ready to build, we have our How to Build a PC guide, a step-by-step guide to make assembling your PC as easy as possible, and our How to Set Up a PC guide to get the BIOS updated, Windows and drivers installed, and all the best settings for maximum performance. If you get value out of this video, please give a like. This makes a huge difference to the channel, and of course subscribe for more cool PC content. Let's jump into it. This video is sponsored by VIP SSD Key. Say goodbye to crazy expensive Windows licenses and that terrible Activate Windows watermark. Right now, use the links in the video description, head over to VIP SSD Key and get a Windows 10 or 11 OEM license for a great price. Pick your product license, then use the PC Builder discount code PC25 for an additional 30% off. Go to the activation settings on your PC, put in the code, and boom! Windows is fully licensed for a crazy low price. And they have Microsoft Office licenses too. Use the links in the video description. Now, the number one most important concept to getting the right CPU and GPU combo in 2025, it's called bottlenecking. This means that one of our components is limiting our performance. Now, when this happens, the only way to get more performance is to upgrade that component that's currently limiting us. For a gaming PC build, the typical bottleneck is the CPU versus the GPU. Now, if our CPU cannot keep up with our GPU, then increasing the speed of the CPU will give us more FPS. But if our GPU is the bottleneck, then getting a faster GPU instead will increase our FPS performance. The CPU is more likely to bottleneck when we're pushing huge amounts of frames, and our GPU is usually the bottleneck when we turn up the resolution from 1080p to 1440p to 4K, including if the GPU does not have enough VRAM to run the latest AAA titles on release at higher ultra settings. No matter what, our system is always going to have a bottleneck. It's our job as PC builders to understand how to maximize our PC build performance, whether that's in gaming, streaming, video editing, or having multi-threaded workloads. Now, once we figure that part out, we want to spend most of our budget on the component that's bottlenecking our overall performance. But so many PC builders get this wrong and they buy a bad CPU and GPU combo. Our goal for a gaming PC build in 2025 is to maximize our FPS for our available budget. Now, that means buying the fastest graphics card that we can afford while only spending enough on our CPU platform that it does not bottleneck our GPU. The smaller your budget, the more important it is to get the best CPU and GPU balance. Now, of course, the term budget is very important here. As if we had unlimited money, then of course, we get the fastest CPU, GPU, SSD, and everything else. And we spend about $6,000 to $10,000 or more on the fastest gaming PC on planet Earth. But most PC builders, they can't spend that much. So getting the right balance for their money, that's critical. And remember that as we go up in resolution from 1080p to 1440p to 4K, that decreases the load on our CPU and it increases the load on our GPU. In 2025, VRAM bottlenecks for graphics cards are also worth considering. Now, while 12 gigabytes of VRAM still probably enough for most 1440p gaming, turning on upscaling like DLSS, it does use more VRAM. And of course, turning on heavy ray tracing uses even more VRAM. That's going from a graphics card like an RTX 5070 12GB up to an RX 9070 XT 16GB or RTX 5070 Ti 16GB can also have added benefits to consider. This can be especially true for more budget builders if you're looking at like an 8GB graphics card, or even moving to 10 or 12 gigabytes on your GPU might allow them to improve their experience at 1440p or even 1080p by going to high or ultra settings. But what about production or creator workloads that need more CPU power? Now, for these use cases, we want more balance, but it does depend heavily on the types of programs that you're using. Take video editing in Adobe Premiere Pro. While going up from a 6-core to an 8-core processor, it does help. So does increasing your GPU power for rendering and export. Oversizing your CPU at the expense of your GPU, that's actually going to hurt your overall performance, and we see this in a lot of professional applications. That's why it's so important for professional users to understand their suite of software programs and the recommended system requirements so that you can get the right CPU and GPU balance for your workloads. All right, let's jump into our recommendations for best CPU and GPU combo for gaming in 2025. Right now, the CPUs that I would consider are the Ryzen 9000, 7000 series, and 5000 series for budget builds. In 2025, I no longer recommend CPUs that are PCIe Gen 3 only, like the Ryzen 5500 and 5700 non-X. You can check out our PC parts to avoid in 2025 for more on why that is. Starting off at the budget level, you can build a gaming PC right now for just about $550 US with all new parts. Now at this level, we really want the cheapest CPU platform that just isn't going to bottleneck our GPU. So right now, the best options are the Ryzen 5600 variants, including the brand new Ryzen 5600T, which performs similarly to the Ryzen 5600X, and you can pick it up for only $99 right now. Now they both come with stock coolers capable of cooling them, something that can't be said for the more expensive Ryzen 5700X. We want to pair these CPUs with budget motherboards. For the Ryzen 5600 CPUs, we're using a B550 motherboard, like the MSI Pro VDH Wi-Fi for about $89, or the ASRock B550M Pro 4 for $99. For RAM, I recommend using both with a $43 kit of 2x16GB DDR4 3200CL16 RAM for a total of 32 gigabytes. Now this brings the total cost of these platforms to between $233 and $263. For our GPU, we could go with either a new GPU or a used one. For new GPUs, you can still pick up an Intel Arc A580 for as little as $170, the Arc A750 for about $200, or an RX 6600 for about $210. On the NVIDIA side, really the cheapest options here are probably the RTX 3060 12GB or RTX 4060 8GB, though both of those GPUs have limited stock right now. They may sell out soon. Other possibilities include the Arc B580 12GB, which has been in short supply and quite expensive, or the Arc B570 10GB, which has been available but for around $280. Note the B series Intel GPUs have a bit of a CPU overhead issue, so I do recommend using them at a minimum resolution of 1440p, not 1080p. We also have the $349 MSRP RX 9060 XT 16GB and the $429 MSRP RTX 5060 Ti 16GB. That's about as high as I would go with these CPUs. These CPUs start hitting a wall right around where we expect the RX 9060 XT and RTX 5060 Ti to come in. This would translate roughly to around an RX 7800 XT or RTX 4060 Ti performance levels in the last generation. At that point, these CPUs can get overwhelmed very quickly in CPU-intensive games or at high FPS in competitive titles like Marvel Rivals, so it's definitely time to look to the next level of CPU performance. The next CPU tier up, kind of the beginning of the mid-range, that I would look to on the AMD side is either the Ryzen 7600 or 7600X for $180 to $200. If you want a little bit more CPU punch, the Ryzen 9600X is now selling for just about $20 more than the 7600X, and it's about 5% faster with a higher end GPU, so another great option. If you're outside the US, the Ryzen 7500F is also fine here, although I'm not ready to recommend the 7400F. And just say no to Ryzen 8000 APUs. Either the Ryzen 7600X, 9600X offers quite a massive up to 20% increase in FPS over the previous tier of CPUs when using a mid-range to high-end GPU like the RX 9070, 9070 XT, or 5070 Ti. I'll leave our Ryzen 7600X and 9600X build guides linked below. For the Ryzen builds, we go with a budget B650 or B850 motherboard, like my new favorite ASRock B850M-X Wi-Fi for just $120, the ASUS TUF B650-E for $140, or the MSI B650 Gaming Wi-Fi for $150. We also want to replace the stock cooler with a budget tower air cooler for around $25, like the id Cooling SE214XT. We want DDR5 6000CL30 RAM for both builds. We can find non-RGB kits for around $85 and RGB kits for around $95 in 32GB total capacity. This gives us an upgrade cost over the previous CPU tier of between $212 and $257. For our GPU combo, I would look for a minimum of an RX 9060 XT, and I would definitely pay more for the 16GB version, or the NVIDIA side, the RTX 5060 with only 8 gigs of VRAM. These CPUs are great performers for the price overall, and they could easily be paired with the RX 9070 or RTX 5070. They will start to fall off right around the RX 9070 XT or 5070 Ti performance level, but you could luckily push them up to an RTX 5080. At this point, we definitely want to consider the next CPU performance tier. Jumping up to our upper mid-range CPU and GPU combos, we basically have two options here. At current pricing for this budget level, the best gaming CPUs are the Ryzen 7700, 7700X, and Ryzen 9700X, which can be had for anywhere between $250 and $300. For gaming on the AMD Ryzen side, we do not want to go to the more expensive 12 or 16 core count non-X3D CPUs, as we don't pick up any more gaming performance over the 8 core models and we spend more money. Now, these CPUs will bump up our average FPS by around 5% over the previous tier at 1440p using a mid-range or high-end GPU, so this is not a huge increase, and the most impact is likely going to be seen improved 1% low frame rates. For motherboards, I've increased our spending to a better B650 or B850 motherboard with more premium features, like the Asus TUF B650-Plus for $170, but you could of course use any of the budget to mid-range boards from the Ryzen 7600X build. And for RAM, we're sticking with DDR5 6000CL30. At this point, we also want at least a dual tower air cooler for between $30 and $50 for all these builds. And you can even find some 240mm all-in-one liquid coolers around that same price now by id Cooling and Thermalright. For our GPU combo, I would look to a minimum of an RX 9070 16GB or RTX 5070 12GB GPU. You don't want to go with a lesser GPU here, and this is the tier that I'm most worried about people oversizing their CPU at the expense of their GPU. You can take these combos all the way up to an RX 9070 XT and beyond to the RTX 5080 or even the 5090. Of course, we hit a lot of bottleneck with almost any gaming CPU that isn't an X3D CPU with the RTX 5090. So at that point, we really just want to move up in terms of our CPU performance to the next tier. All right, let's jump up to the current ultimate tier of gaming CPUs in 2025. That is the 9800X3D. With the 9950X3D mentioned here, only if you also do a lot of production or professional work that would benefit from more than 8 CPU cores. Just know there's really no gaming performance difference between these two CPUs, you're just spending more money. We do have build guides on the channel for the 9800X3D and a 9950X build guide that will work just fine for the 9950X3D, and I will leave them linked down in the video description. Now, the 9800X3D, it can be stock challenged at times, but you'll generally find it for $480. There is also the 9950X3D, which currently sells for around $699. The 7800X3D is currently about $100 less than the 9800X3D and does give most of the performance boost, so it is also a great value for mid-range and even some high-end GPUs. I generally don't like the other Ryzen 7000 X3D parts or the 9900 X3D, as they're just lower performance. And note that Intel just can't keep up with these CPUs, so don't even bother with the i9 1400K or Ultra9 285K. The Ryzen 9800 X3D or 9950 X3D is gonna offer at least 10% better gaming performance with an RTX 4090 at 1440p ultra detail settings, even more with an RTX 5090 if you can get one. And in some titles, the performance increase is even more massive. We're going to pair our Ryzen 9800X3D or 9950X3D with a B650E, X670E, B850 or X870E motherboard just for the PCIe Gen 5 GPU slot, and that's just in case it's ever relevant. So we're going to find a motherboard like the ASRock B850 Live Mixer for $189, Asus Prime X670E for $209, or MSI B850 Tomahawk for $229. Check out our best Ryzen Motherboard 2025 video for a lot more high-end options. We want any of the dual tower air coolers we've listed before for the 9800X3D. My strong recommendation for the 9950X3D, go for a high-performance liquid cooler for around $100, like the 280mm Arctic Liquid Freezer 3 or the Cooler Master Master Liquid 360mm. For RAM, we could use a DDR5 6000CL30 kit, but I spent an extra $20 going to DDR5 6000CL28 because we're running out of things to upgrade basically. The 9800X3D upgrade is about $249 over the previous tier, with the 9950X upgrade being $529 more expensive than the previous CPU tier. For GPU combos, I'd recommend a minimum of a Radeon RX 9070 XT. Right now, that's AMD's fastest graphics card in this generation, or look at an NVIDIA RTX 5070 Ti. Obviously, this is the fastest gaming CPU on the planet, so we can pair it with the RTX 5080 and RTX 5090 if you can find one. Congratulations, you own one of the fastest gaming PCs on planet Earth. And AMD is rumored to be working on a GPU faster than the RX 9070 XT, so yes, this would also be great for that as well. Getting the best Ryzen motherboard 2025, it's confusing. Now, whether you're building a budget gaming PC with the Ryzen 5600 or the ultimate gaming PC with the Ryzen 9800X 3D, there's so many different motherboard features, pricing is just all over the place, it's hard to even know which board you need. So we're going to break it all down for the best Ryzen motherboard 2025, Ryzen 5000, 7000, and 9000 series CPUs. Now, the most confusing part of buying the best Ryzen motherboard 2025, it's understanding the different chipsets from B550 to X670, X870E to B850, B650, A620, it just keeps going. The first thing to focus on is the first number that comes after the letter. So for instance, focus on the 6 in the B650, as that tells you the generation of motherboard. Motherboards in the 500 series and older, so B550 motherboards for instance, are all on the AM4 socket, which supports Ryzen 5000 and earlier CPUs, which have the pins on the CPU itself. Motherboards in the 600 and 800 series, like the B650 and X870E, are on the new AM5 socket, with the pins on the motherboard, and they support Ryzen 9000 and 7000 series CPUs and Ryzen 8000G APUs. So if you have a Ryzen 9000 or 7000 CPU, you'll need a 600 or 800 series motherboard, and for Ryzen 5000 CPUs, we recommend a 500 series motherboard. Be careful, as Intel motherboards have very similar sounding chipset names, so you'll want to double check you're getting the right one. Next, let's look at the first letter in the motherboard name. Now, most people watching this video will want to get a B series motherboard with a 50 in the name, like a B550, B650, or B850, as these motherboards usually have the best price to performance features. A series motherboards aren't much cheaper than B series boards and do not include support for AMD's auto overclocking feature called Precision Boost Overdrive, or PBO for short, which we generally want to enable in the BIOS for the best performance. Also, the new B840 motherboards are just A-series motherboards in disguise. The X-series of boards are primarily aimed at high-end creators or production users who need a ton of M.2 SSD and USB connections. X-series motherboards usually cost quite a bit more than B-series motherboards, but they sometimes can be found on a deal. AMD also added an E to some of the B650, X670, and X870 motherboards in an attempt to specify that these motherboards have both PCIe Gen 5 GPU slots, as well as at least one PCIe Gen 5 N.2 NVMe SSD slot at the same time. But this is just not consistent. Some of the B850 motherboards have both as well, and they don't have an E. My advice is just to focus on getting the features that you want, and just consider the E boards in the same category as non-E boards. So B650 and B650E, it's just B650. There are some minor differences with X870 and X870E, the main difference being that the X870E has more PCIe lanes for more device connections. So here's my chipset recommendations based on your CPU. For budget builds with a Ryzen 5600, 5600X, 5700X 3D, or other Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, you want a B550 motherboard to ensure that you get PCIe Gen 4, which is now required to get the most out of budget and mid-range GPUs. For Ryzen 7000 and 9000 series CPUs, if you're primarily a gamer, then a B650 or B850 motherboard, that's what you want, unless you see a deal on X670 or X870 motherboards. Now, professional workstation users or creators who need large amounts of M.2 NVMe SSDs or rear panel USB connections, look at X670 and X870 motherboards. Do not skip this section. The BIOS Flashback feature, now Gigabyte calls this QFlash Plus, it allows you to update the motherboard BIOS without a compatible CPU installed. Now, this is critical if your motherboard does not come with an updated BIOS that supports the CPU that you bought. And mostly this pertains to the AM5 motherboards with newer Ryzen 9000 series CPUs. Now, all the AM5 socket motherboards that I've seen, they have BIOS Flashback. This ensures that no matter what motherboard and CPU combo you buy, you will be able to get the system to boot after updating the BIOS. Using BIOS Flashback, it's super easy to do. We cover how to do this step by step in our How to Build a PC guide that's linked down in the video description. Mainstream motherboards come in 4 sizes, also called form factors: a full-size ATX form factor, a 2/3 size called a micro ATX or mATX for short, and a mini ITX motherboard intended for small form factor builds. Now, there's also an extended ATX or eATX motherboard, which is the same height as the ATX board, just a little wider. Now, most of you will likely want either a full-size ATX or a micro ATX motherboard, but we'll make mini ITX motherboard recommendations as well. Note that mini ITX motherboards tend to be quite a bit more expensive. Micro ATX motherboards usually have an M at the end of the chipset name, for instance B650M, and mini ITX boards have an I at the end of their chipset name, for instance B650I. Now make sure that your motherboard size fits in your case. Smaller boards fit in larger cases, but ATX boards are not going to fit in a micro ATX size case. Alright, let's talk about PCIe Gen 5 M.2 NVMe SSDs, which are quite controversial. Gen 5 NVMe SSDs are twice as expensive per terabyte as PCIe Gen 3 and Gen 4 NVMe SSD drives, and they offer zero gaming benefit or other home use benefit. Even very few professionals see any tangible benefits using it in a PC build. Now, PCIe is backwards compatible, so you can use a Gen 3 or Gen 4 NVMe SSD in your Gen 5 motherboard M.2 slot. Just don't pay anything extra specifically to get that PCIe Gen 5 M.2 slot on your motherboard. Next up is the PCIe Gen 5 GPU slot. We now have the RTX 50 series, which are the first PCIe Gen 5 GPUs. But an RTX 5090 runs just fine on PCIe Gen 4 GPU slots, so you don't actually need a PCIe Gen 5 motherboard slot as PCIe is backwards compatible. So this remains an optional, possibly future-proofing feature for ultra high-end builders. I will say that PCIe Gen 5 GPU slot equipped motherboards have massively dropped down in price, and they now start around $180 in the US. So if you are considering two premium motherboards with similar features, but one has a PCIe Gen 5 GPU slot, maybe you grab that one just in case. Let's briefly touch on the VRMs. That's the power delivery in a half square around the CPU. Now, in years past, we found that some previous generations of motherboards wouldn't run the highest end CPUs without their VRMs overheating. However, this really hasn't been an issue with AM4 Ryzen motherboards or AM5 Ryzen motherboards. For gamers, any motherboard that we're going to recommend, it's going to be fine with a Ryzen 5 or 7 CPU, including the X3D ones, like the Ryzen 9800 X3D. For production users, using a Ryzen 9 CPU with 12 or 16 cores, you'll want a higher end motherboard with creator and production features anyway, so it's not going to be an issue. M.2 storage connections are a critical feature for most users. For AM5 motherboards, most budget to lower mid-range boards have at least 2 NVMe SSD slots, the mid-range to premium B series motherboards have 3, and X670 and X870 generally have 4, with some having 5. As we previously discussed, most of these slots can run up to Gen 4 speed, but some are rated for Gen 5 speed. Remember, you can buy a PCIe add-in card to get additional M.2 connections. Now, many motherboards come with built-in heat sinks for M.2 drives, so consider that before you buy an SSD with a pre-installed heat shield. In addition, most motherboards come with at least 4 SATA drive connections for your SATA SSDs and SATA hard drives. Let's talk about motherboard audio. Now, the audio section of the motherboard, it's in the bottom left-hand corner of the board, and it's made up of capacitors, shielding, and a Realtek audio codec chip. Use this audio anytime you plug in an analog device with a connector that looks like this, either into the rear panel audio connectors or the ones on the front panel of your PC case. Now, if instead you're plugging in a sound device with a digital connection like HDMI or USB, then you're going to bypass the onboard motherboard audio processing, and instead you'll be using the secondary device for digital to analog conversion. Budget audio codecs, they can sound fine, and they're typically in the 800 series, such as the ALC897. More premium audio codecs have better overall signal to noise ratios and additional audio signal boost for your front panel headphones, like the ALC1200. The best audio codecs are the ALC1220 or the newer, but similar ALC4080, both of which offer additional encoding and decoding support, as well as support for high impedance headphones when using the front PC case audio plugs. Let's talk about those rear panel USB connections. That is probably the most important feature that users totally forget to consider when buying the best Ryzen motherboard in 2025. USB connections come in different speeds and physical types. For the rear I/O panel, most boards offer a range of USB-A connections at different speeds, from USB 2.0, those usually the black USB connections, to USB 3.2 Gen 1, typically colored blue, to USB 3.2 Gen 2 connections, often colored red. There are also USB Type-C connectors, which are the smaller but faster connections. Most X870 motherboards also come with at least one USB Type-C port running at USB 4 speed, something that isn't necessarily that useful for most regular users. Motherboards also have headers to plug in the front PC case USB connections for both USB 3.2 and slower 2.0 ports, and some come with USB Type-C headers, particularly the newer 600 and 800 series motherboards. For network connectivity, your motherboard will come with wired Ethernet. Now, the older boards are generally 1 gigabit per second connections, while most of the newer 600 and 800 series boards come with at least 2.5 gigabit speed. Many now come with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, either built in or added in using an M.2 Wi-Fi key. Now you can always buy a USB, M.2, or PCIe add-in card to get Wi-Fi and Bluetooth later. Stop buying bad RAM! Let's get you the best RAM for gaming 2025. RAM speed is the #1 thing that most gamers get wrong. Now, just like your CPU, RAM operates on clock cycles. RAM for modern PCs is double data rate, meaning the RAM transfers data twice during each clock cycle. But here's the part that so many get wrong. RAM speed is in mega transfers, it's not in megahertz. When you buy 6000 speed RAM, that speed is in mega transfers and it runs at a clock speed of 3000 megahertz. And because it transfers data twice per clock cycle, 3000 megahertz times 2 equals to 6000 mega transfers. Now, where this can be a problem is when users check diagnostic software like in CPU-Z or in the BIOS, and they see there's 6000 speed memory running at 3000 megahertz, and they think something's wrong. In fact, so many people refer to RAM speed mistakenly in megahertz that some motherboard manufacturers label the RAM speed in megahertz in the BIOS, even though that is technically incorrect. So hopefully this helps you navigate any confusion in the future. The second part of determining the RAM speed, it's called the CAS latency, often abbreviated as either C or CL, followed by a number. CAS latency is the number of clock cycles the RAM takes to do something. So the lower the CAS latency, the faster the RAM can get things done. So when thinking about RAM speed, we generally want a faster speed and a lower CAS latency. There are other subtimings, of course, but this is the one that most users are going to want to pay attention to. So how do you compare the different speeds of different RAM kits? Say one at 6000 CL30 and one at 6400 CL32. The most common way is to calculate the absolute latency of the kits, and the one with the lowest absolute latency, that's the fastest. Now, the way we do this is to multiply the CAS latency by 2000 and then divide that number by the RAM speed. For the 6400 CL32 kit, multiplying 32 times 2000 gives us 64,000. We then divide that by our 6400 speed, which gives us 10. That number is in nanoseconds, so 10 nanoseconds absolute latency. For the 6000 CL30 kit, we multiply 30 times 2000, which is 60,000, then divide it by the 6000 speed, which is also 10. So both kits are 10 nanoseconds, and they are essentially the same speed. If we had a 6000 CL28 kit, we'd find the kit had an absolute latency of 9.33 nanoseconds, which would be the faster of the kits. However, not everything boils down to absolute latency, as CPUs have a memory controller that runs independently of the RAM. The CPU memory controller does need to keep up with the RAM speed, and if your RAM is running above a certain speed in mega transfers, the CPU controller might either fail to boot or run in a mode that reduces performance. Thus, while a DDR5 6400 CL32 kit has the same absolute latency as DDR5 6000 CL30, many Ryzen 7000 and 9000 CPUs will give lower performance with the 6400 CL32 kit because it's out of their sweet spot. This differs by CPU, so we'll talk more about this in our specific RAM recommendations for specific CPUs later in the video. Of course, all RAM on the DIY PC market is intended to be overclocked, typically using a one-click overclocking profile called XMP, DOCP, or EXPO. Now, until you go into the BIOS and activate the one-click overclocking profile, your RAM is going to run at a much slower speed and looser timings than advertised on the box. We cover how to do this in our How to Set Up a PC video, so I'll leave that link down in the video description for you to check out. DDR4 AMD motherboards will use either XMP or DOCP, and DDR5 AMD motherboards will use either XMP or AMD's EXPO one-click overclocking profiles. Note that virtually every kit that has an AMD DOCP or EXPO profile also includes an Intel XMP profile. You can, of course, also manually tune your RAM by going into the BIOS and adjusting tons of different settings, but I don't recommend that for most users, and you really need to know what you're doing. My advice, just use the one-click overclocking profiles. Now, warning, because RAM is designed to be overclocked, many users get confused when they look at their CPU or their motherboard specs, and the maximum RAM speed is listed as a much lower number. Remember, those specs are the stock setting, and do-it-yourself PC builds and even pre-builds are designed to use the one-click overclocking profiles, and that's why those numbers are different. Now, in full disclosure, both AMD and Intel include statements that any overclocking, even the use of these one-click profiles, may void your warranty. However, both companies have a don't ask, don't tell policy regarding overclocking, and for over a decade have honored their warranties in these situations. So my advice is to use the one-click overclocking profiles and trust that if needed, they'll honor your warranty. But if you want, you can stick to the stock rated speeds. How much RAM do you need for gaming in 2025? I strongly recommend 32 gigabytes total for system RAM for gaming in 2025. We've now seen several new AAA titles where only 16 gigabytes of RAM does lead to some micro stuttering. It's not game breaking, but RAM's gotten so much cheaper that it's really a no-brainer. And if you're building a mid-range or higher end system, you're going to be using DDR5 RAM, more on that in just a second. And those kits largely start at 32 gigabytes total, so there's really no sense trying to go lower. There are a handful of mostly niche simulation games that do need more RAM, so if you play one of those, check the recommended system specs. But for most users, 32 gigabytes is more than enough for gaming, streaming, even professional level video editing. All right, let's talk DDR4 versus DDR5. Now, DDR4 is the older memory standard still used on Ryzen 5000 and older CPUs. Ryzen 7000 and newer CPUs are all on the new DDR5 standard only. Note that DDR4 and DDR5 have different physical pin layouts, so DDR4 cannot be used in a DDR5 motherboard socket or the other way around. We cover how to install RAM in our How to Build a PC guide linked down in the video description, so check that out for more. How many sticks of RAM should you buy? RAM is typically sold in kits of 2 sticks, and those sticks are called DIMMs. That's D-I-M-M. But I'm going to refer to them as sticks just for simplicity. For new builds, I recommend a 2-stick configuration for both DDR4 and DDR5. You do not want to run a single stick, as this limits the RAM bandwidth versus a 2-stick configuration. It's worse on DDR4, but even on DDR5, you will lose some FPS. Now, I don't recommend 4-stick configurations. For DDR4, it's just not cost effective, and for DDR5, the CPU memory controllers for the currently available CPUs just cannot handle it effectively at the speeds that we want to run them out without manually tuning them. If you are upgrading from 16 gigabytes to 32 gigabytes on a DDR4 PC, it is okay to just buy an identical kit to the one you already have. Never mix and match different RAM kits. And I recommend that when you install the RAM, you put the old kit in the first 2 slots and the new kit in the 3rd and 4th slots to maximize your compatibility. Let's start with the most popular mid-range and high-end gaming CPUs, starting with the Ryzen 7000 and 9000 series CPUs like the Ryzen 7600X, Ryzen 9700X, or Ryzen 9800X 3D. The great news is it's an easy answer. Just get a 2x16 gigabyte kit, so 32 gigabytes total, of DDR5 6000CL30, turn on the AMD EXPO or Intel XMP profile, and profit. With Ryzen AM5 CPUs, you want the CPU memory controller to run at the same clock speed as the RAM, what we call a 1-to-1 ratio, with the Infinity Fabric running as fast as possible, typically 2000 MHz. The CPU memory controllers on both Ryzen 7000 and 9000 series CPUs have trouble going above 3000 MHz. Remember, that equates to 6000 mega transfers on the RAM, so even going up to 6200 or 6400 mega transfer speed could result in lower performance. Now, if all that confuses you, don't worry. Just get a DDR5 6000CL30 kit and you'll be maxing out your performance. We've now seen some DDR5 6000CL28, even CL26 kits hit the market. In my testing, we didn't see much performance gain with CL28 kits versus CL30, but they're only a little bit more expensive, so feel free to grab one if you want. Right now, the CL26 kits are crazy expensive, and I just avoid them and spend my money on something else instead. Finally, in terms of AMD EXPO versus Intel XMP profiles, really don't see any performance differences between these two, and all the motherboards will use either one, so really don't worry about which one you get. I'd recommend using the EXPO profile if your RAM kit comes with both XMP and EXPO profiles, and this is becoming quite common in 2025. For those of you who live outside the US in a really challenging market where maybe DDR5 6000CL30 either not available or super expensive, you can of course get 5600 CL40 or faster, even go down to 5200 CL40 if you have to. For budget gaming CPUs like the Ryzen 5000 CPUs, what we're primarily looking for here is the cheapest way to get to 32 gigabytes. That's going to be either a DDR4 3200 CL16 kit or DDR4 3600 CL18 kit. Those are both the same speed. Don't exceed 3600 mega transfer speed, as the CPU memory controllers have a hard time with this. Do not overspend here. The whole point of super budget gaming CPUs is to push that extra money to get a better GPU, not overspend on your RAM. Getting the best CPU cooler in 2025 can be extremely confusing. How big a cooler do you need for your CPU? Should you go for air or liquid cooling? Let's start off with liquid versus air CPU coolers in 2025. Air coolers have come a long way in 2025. They're more powerful and affordable than ever. You can now cool high-end CPUs like the Ryzen 9950X 3D with air coolers under $50 in the US and they're unbeatable value for budget builds. As long as the cooler design ensures good contact with the CPU, the only real concern is the fan, which typically lasts up to 10 years, and it's easy to replace on most models. The downsides? Air coolers can ramp up noise quickly under sudden loads, they're bulkier, they may need more vertical clearance, and dual tower models can overhang the first 2 RAM slots. What about liquid coolers? Well, there's 2 kinds. There's custom loops and all-in-one, or AIO for short. We're focusing on AIOs here, as custom loops are extremely complex. In 2025, AIO liquid coolers are more affordable, starting at around $45, and they can outperform air coolers under heavy loads, though most builds won't reach that level. AIOs also offer a more consistent noise profile, sleeker visuals, and options like LCD screens without covering your RAM. However, they come with potential failure point, the pump. In 2025, leaks are almost unheard of, but a dead pump means no cooling. And for budget builds, the extra cost doesn't make sense. An AIO cooler also has to be installed properly, with at least part of the radiator above the pump. I'll link our AIO installation guide in the video description for more. So is air or liquid CPU cooling better in 2025? Well, for budget gaming PCs, air is really the only way to go. For mid-range and higher-end builds, personally, I prefer liquid coolers, but in 2025, there's no wrong answer. It's really up to your preference. So what type of CPU coolers are you going to find on the market in 2025? Well, for air coolers, most downdraft style CPU coolers, they're relatively cheap. And sometimes CPUs like the Ryzen 5600 or i5 12400 come with included downdraft style coolers that we refer to as stock coolers. For space-constrained mini ITX builds, there are more powerful and more expensive downdraft style coolers. Budget tower air coolers cost between $18 to $35 US and are an incredibly powerful upgrade over the downdraft style coolers and a staple of budget and mid-range PC builds. Dual tower air coolers start around $30 US and make a huge leap up in cooling performance, now able to cool even the most powerful Ryzen CPUs. Liquid AIO CPU cooler categories are named by the size of the fan that they use, either 120mm fans or the less common 140mm fan. An AIO cooler with 2 140mm fans is called a 240mm AIO. 3 120mm fans is a 360mm. As the number of fans goes up, the radiator also gets larger. An AIO that uses 2 140mm fans is called a 280mm, and the biggest is a 420mm AIO that uses 3 140mm fans. Single fan AIOs are only as powerful as a budget tower air cooler, and I'd only consider these for space-constrained mini ITX builds, mostly due to their cost. 240mm AIOs are the most common and start around $45, and 360mm AIOs start around $60 and can be incredibly powerful for extreme CPU heat loads. Here's a controversial topic: how much thermal paste do you need to use? Well, repeated testing has shown that too much paste, that's fine, while not using enough, that hurts performance. Personally, I err on the side of slightly too much paste. I typically make a thin X with 4 very small dots in between, then using the paste spatula or other rigid edge to spread the paste about evenly across the CPU before I install the cooler. Virtually every CPU cooler in 2025 will come with enough thermal paste for at least one application, so you don't necessarily need to buy your own, but a tube of Arctic MX4 with the paste spreader, it's about $7. Some coolers come with pre-applied thermal paste on the bottom of the cooler, and that's generally fine as well. Now, thermal paste will typically degrade in 3 to 5 years, depending on the paste, and you'll need to clean it off and reapply the thermal paste, which is fairly easy to do. Check your paste for its estimated lifespan. You can buy a high-performance thermal paste like Thermal Grizzly Duranaut for about $20 on Amazon or $11 directly from Thermal Grizzly, but I'd only recommend this as an option for higher-end PC builds. Otherwise, spend that $20 just getting a better cooler. There are also thermal pads available as an alternative to thermal paste, like the Thermal Grizzly Cryo Sheet, but again, it's an additional cost. I'd only consider this for mid-range or higher-end builds. So you do need a contact frame for your CPU. Well, short answer, no for AMD. How much CPU cooling does your CPU require? We'll focus on relevant new CPUs available at retail in 2025, and for Ryzen CPUs, I am assuming that we're going to enable Precision Boost Overdrive. That's AMD's one-click auto overclocking feature for free additional performance. Now, for the most popular budget gaming CPUs, so like the Ryzen 5600, 5600X, 5600T, these all come with perfectly adequate stock coolers. You can add a budget tower air cooler for better noise and thermals, and the Ryzen 5700X. I recommend at least a budget tower air cooler, though the 5700X and i5 12600K, they can benefit from a cheap dual tower cooler. My minimum recommendation for the Ryzen 5700X 3D for you upgraders out there is a dual tower air cooler or a cheap 240mm AIO. Now moving over to mid-range gaming Ryzen CPUs, we've got the Ryzen 7000 and 9000 CPUs in the Ryzen 5 lineup, like the Ryzen 7600X, Ryzen 7600, Ryzen 9600X, and Ryzen 7500F. I want you to avoid the Ryzen 7400F and any Ryzen 8000 series APU. For Ryzen 5 7000 9000 series CPUs, I recommend at least a budget tower air cooler, and honestly, that's all you really need, as long as your case has good airflow. The Ryzen 7500F and 7600 non-X, they do come with an included stock cooler. It's fine, but given how cheap budget tower air coolers are, and given that we can get some additional performance, I'd switch it out. Moving up to higher end gaming CPUs, we've got the Ryzen 7 CPUs in the 7000 and 9000 series, like the Ryzen 7700X, Ryzen 9700X, and the Ryzen 9800X 3D, along with the Ryzen 7800X 3D, with the X3D CPUs being a little tougher to cool than the regular Ryzen 7 CPUs. I recommend a minimum of a dual tower air cooler for both performance and noise. And these CPUs are also great with a 240mm AIO or larger cooler. Particularly for the Ryzen 9800X 3D, you're spending quite a bit on this build. I mean, the CPU is almost $500, so don't cheap out on the cooling. For higher end Ryzen production CPUs in the Ryzen 9 range for the 7000 and 9000 series, like the Ryzen 9900X, 9950X, and the X3D variants like the Ryzen 9950X 3D, a good quality dual tower air cooler is absolutely fine. Though depending on how heavy the heat load is for your workloads, I'd look to a good quality 240mm or 360mm cooler for the most consistent noise performance. Stop buying bad PSUs! Let's get you the best PC power supply 2025. Now the power supply, abbreviated PSU, comes in different sizes. ATX size PSUs, those are the most common and they fit most ATX and micro ATX size cases. Smaller SFX power supplies are for mini ITX PC cases. They tend to be a bit more expensive. For cables, some budget PSUs are still using non-modular, meaning they come with all the cables permanently attached. But in 2025, most mid-range and higher-end PSUs are modular, where the cables can be removed if you don't need them. Now, huge warning here. Do not blow up your PC by mixing and matching PSU cables from a different brand or even a different model. While the connections on the PC side, those are standard, the connections on the PSU side are not. So do not destroy your PC by using cables that are not designed for it. If you want to extend the reach or add color to your PC build, you can buy a PSU cable extension. These plug into the ends of the existing cables, not into the PSU itself, and they typically cost around $25 to $50. Some companies like CableMod do make colored cables that are designed as full cable replacements for your PSU. Just make sure to order the correct one for your PSU model. Now, one troubleshooting note here, if you have any issues with your GPU or your PC that seem possibly hardware related, I recommend you remove any cable extensions and use the original cables that came with your PSU. In my experience, this is probably the #1 most common fix. Let's talk about GPU power cables, starting with the tried and true 8-pin. Usually is a 6 plus 2-pin cable, but also called the 8-pin. Most of these cables have a second 6 plus 2-pin cable on the same physical cable. In 2025, I recommend using separate cables for each GPU connection, but it is okay to daisy chain them if you run out of individual connections. These connectors need to be pushed together properly with the plastic guide on the +2 cable going above the +6 cable part. Otherwise, the cable will not seat properly, and again, this can cause you GPU power issues. And note that on newer PSUs, sometimes one of the 8-pin cables will use the 12-volt high power cable connection on the PSU side. Then we've got the controversial 12-pin high-volt power cable, sometimes called the 16-pin, which NVIDIA has made standard on their GPUs since the RTX 30 series. Though most NVIDIA GPUs do come with adapters for the 8-pin PSU cables as well. Now, these cables have been prone to melting, particularly when they're bent too much near the connection point for either the PSU or the GPU. PSU maker Seasonic recommends not bending the 12-volt high power cable in the first 35mm or 1.4 inches to make sure it's fully seated. The pins for this adapter were redesigned to supposedly fix this issue and are called 12-volt 2x6 and found on PSUs labeled as ATX 3.1. Note that those redesigned pins are on the PSU side and the GPU side, as the cable itself actually doesn't have any physical pins. Let's quickly cover the other cables that come with your PSU and what they're for. The 20 plus 4-pin adapter cable, also called the 24-pin cable, that powers your motherboard and it plugs into the right side of the motherboard. The 4 plus 4 EPS power cable also supplies power to the motherboard and typically plugs into the top left of the motherboard. Sometimes these cables have helpful connectors to keep the 4-pin plugs together, as is the case with their Asus Prime 850-watt unit. Some motherboards do have additional connections for a second EPS cable, and while most boards will run with only one EPS cable attached, I recommend getting a PSU that has enough EPS cables for your motherboard. Then we've got SATA power cables, which power both SATA drives, but also a lot of AIO pumps, fans, and RGB controllers, and other devices. And you'll still find Molex power connectors as well, though very few devices use these any longer. So how do you buy the best PSU in 2025? We want it to cleanly supply the power that our PC needs, but also want to protect it if something goes wrong. Basically, how do you avoid buying an exploding power supply? First, ignore the 80+ rating because they are largely meaningless. We've seen gold-rated power supplies explode while bronze ones go strong. And honestly, the power savings difference between even the lowest rated 80+ white PSU and the best 80+ titanium unit, it's tiny, even over years. Now, previously we used the PSU cultist list, but it hasn't been updated in over 2 years. So I'm now recommending a new list called the SPL PSU tier list. The SPL PSU tier list is being actively maintained as a public Google sheet by lead author SPL and other experts from Zach's Tech Turf Discord, so I want to say a big thank you for picking up the baton and carrying on. They look at teardown reviews of all the units, they check the specs, and determine the quality of the unit with a letter grade, with A being the best, B being good, C being a budget unit, and anything below that, just avoid it for a gaming PC. These ratings include the quality of the components, the PSU power delivery design, the protections on the PSU that prevent it from blowing up, and how steady the power is supplied, something called ripple. The SPL PSU tier list fully describes their methodology and contains a full listing by manufacturer for all units, where enough is known to give a final grade, as well as a separate list of PSUs where they take a guess at the grade for PSUs without enough information. My recommendation, start with a list with proper recommendations. If you don't find it there, then check the larger list with speculative grades, though I'd really want to buy something that has a proper grade. I've linked the list down in the video description. In terms of comparison between the PSU cultist list and the SPL list, the SPL list has more stringent requirements, particularly for tier A. So you might find that some of the PSUs that we had classified on the PSU cultist list or speculatively classified them as tier A because it hadn't been updated for a couple of years. You may find they're actually tier B on the SPL list. Going forward, we are just going to use the SPL list. So what tier of PSU should you use in your next PC build or upgrade? Well, no matter what, I would never go below C tier, and I always prefer to get a better rated unit if the price is similar. At the budget build level, C tier, it's probably fine. As we go up in component power draw and the price of the system increases, you can kind of think of this going up a tier like insurance. So for mid-range price builds, I'd look for a B or an A tier rated unit. At the high end, I would only use an A tier rated PSU, especially when using high power draw parts or if I'm intending to heavily overclock the CPU or the GPU. But what about ATX 3.0, ATX 3.1, PCIe 5.0, PCIe 5.1? What does all that mean for power supplies? Well, ATX and PCIe are standards for different computer parts, including power supplies. ATX 3.0 and PCIe 5.0 help power supplies handle sudden power spikes from GPUs and CPUs better. ATX 3.1 changed the 12-volt high power cable to a safer 2x6 pin design, helping to stop cables from melting. If you're buying an NVIDIA GPU, I would choose an ATX 3.1 power supply. For AMD or Intel GPUs, ATX 3.0 is fine, but many newer power supplies are already switching to ATX 3.1 anyway. So how many watts does your PSU need? Well, in order to account for things like transient power spikes, where your GPU or your CPU might draw several times its rated power over a very brief period of time, I recommend sizing your PSU at least 1.5 times the rated power draw in PC Part Picker. If my rated draw of all my components in there is 500 watts, then multiplying that by 1.5 gives a 750 watt minimum PSU. Of course, bigger is always fine as well. If you end up with a weird number like 715 watts, then I recommend just rounding up or down to the nearest 50 watt mark. In this case, 700 watts would be likely fine. For the vast majority of builds, this method usually results in recommending PSU wattages from 600 to 850 watts, with most of the rest covered by 1000 watt units and only a handful of current configurations requiring more than 1000 watts. From a cost perspective, it's relatively small price difference for peace of mind. Stop buying bad SSDs! Let's get you the best SSD for gaming 2025. In 2025, you basically have 3 gaming storage choices, only one of which is actually correct. Starting off with traditional hard drives, which use mechanical spinning disks. In 2025, these are massively outdated, they have no place in a new gaming PC build, and I want you to just forget they even exist. Then we've got SATA SSDs. These are typically available as a 2.5-inch drive using SATA cables, but they can also come in the M.2 form factor. Now, while they're faster than traditional hard drives, these are also heavily outdated in 2025 unless your PC is very old and only has SATA ports. Then we've got M.2 NVMe SSDs. This is the clear winner for the best gaming SSD in 2025. It's significantly faster than a SATA SSD, and it's similarly priced or even cheaper sometimes. These plug into the M.2 socket on modern PC motherboards as well as laptops. M.2 NVMe SSDs come in different sizes. The most common used for PC gaming and the PS5, it's called socket 2280. Just means 22 millimeters wide by 80 millimeters long. Handheld gaming devices like the Steam Deck and Asus ROG Ally, those use the shorter socket 2230 M.2 NVMe drives, which are only 30 millimeters in length, hence the name. While other sizes exist, these are the most common, and that's what I'd recommend. But what about SSD speed? M.2 NVMe's, they use the PCIe interface, and the speeds are broken down into generations. The most common are PCIe Gen 3 and Gen 4 SSDs. For a comparison, a PCIe Gen 3 SSD is up to 6 times faster than a SATA SSD, while PCIe Gen 4 NVMe SSDs are theoretically twice as fast as PCIe Gen 3, and the current fastest drives are PCIe Gen 5, which are twice as fast as PCIe Gen 4. PCIe drives are backwards compatible, so you can plug a Gen 3 drive into a Gen 5 motherboard slot and the other way around. It's just going to run at the slowest rated speed, in this case PCIe Gen 3. Let's talk about TLC versus QLC. What am I talking about? Well, today, 2 types of NVMe SSDs are most common based on how much data they can store per unit of memory. So triple level cells, or TLC drives, they store 3 bits of data per cell, while the cheaper but slightly slower quad level cell, or QLC drives, write 4 bits of data per cell. For gaming in 2025, both TLC and QLC drives, they perform similarly, and they can easily last many years beyond their warranties. Now, to speed up writing to the SSD, NVMe drives use a cache system, which temporarily stores files on a limited size but faster memory. Those files are then transferred from the fast memory to the slower long-term memory cells. Caching speeds up the writing process as long as the file size does not exceed the size of the cache. Now, in 2025, there are 3 types of cache. An HMB, or host memory buffer process, that borrows a small portion of your PC's RAM, a single level cell, or SLC cache, that uses faster SSD cells, and a DRAM cache, which is the fastest, using an onboard RAM built directly into the SSD. Cache only affects write speeds, not game loading or reading speeds, so most gamers are going to find that modern SLC or HMB drives, those are perfectly sufficient for gaming. If you do professional workloads that involve heavy file transfers, a DRAM cache SSD will be beneficial, but it's also going to be a little bit more expensive. Many NVMe SSDs now have 2 versions, one with a built-in metal heatsink and one without. So which one should you get? Well, for PS5, because it's a cramped environment without much airflow, Sony recommends that you use an NVMe SSD with a built-in heatsink. For PC gaming, on the other hand, I generally recommend that you do not buy an NVMe SSD with a built-in heatsink. First, most of the affordable Gen 3 and Gen 4 NVMe SSDs that I recommend, they don't get hot enough in a roomier environment of a PC to need a heatsink. Second, many motherboards come with their own built-in heatsinks, which aren't going to fit an SSD with a built-in heatsink on its own. And third, manufacturers can claim that if you remove the built-in heatsink, then it voids your warranty. Note that some drives, like the Team Group Cardea A440, come with a removable heatsink. If you're wondering if you should remove the sticker on the drive, the answer is no, because it usually is made out of a special material to help distribute the heat from the hotter controller chip to the NAND storage chips that need to be at least warm to operate at peak capacity. How much storage do you need for gaming in 2025? Well, for budget PC gaming builds in 2025, I'm upping my minimum storage capacity to 1 terabyte. Games have just gotten so big, prices for NVMe SSDs have gotten so much cheaper, it's just a no-brainer right now. For mid-range PC builds, you should really consider 2TB SSDs if you can, and for high-end PC builds, you certainly can look at 4TB as well. And it's not 2015 anymore. You do not need a separate boot and storage drive. A single high-capacity drive is absolutely fine unless you do heavy professional work, then you might get several drives instead. Now, warning for you SSD upgraders out there, if you are upgrading from a SATA hard drive or a SATA SSD to an NVMe SSD, don't make the mistake of trying to clone your old drive to the NVMe. It can be a problematic process. If this is your boot drive, I recommend a clean Windows install on the NVMe, then use a data migration tool to move everything over from the old SATA drives. Let's talk about gaming performance. Does a faster NVMe SSD give you more FPS in PC gaming? For years, we've been told that in the future, games using direct storage technologies are going to revolutionize gaming and get us tons more FPS. But honestly, it just hasn't worked out that way. Repeated testing by multiple outlets shows that there is absolutely zero, and I mean zero, FPS benefit using anything faster than even a SATA SSD. And that includes testing in games using direct storage technology. But what about loading times? Certainly that's improved by using a faster drive, right? Wrong. Well, loading times make a massive improvement when moving from an old school hard drive to a SATA SSD. That's essentially where the performance increase ends. Gen 3, Gen 4, and even Gen 5 NVMe SSDs, they only improve loading times over SATA SSDs by a couple of seconds at most. So what's the best gaming SSD for your money? Well, prices for Gen 3 and Gen 4 NVMe SSDs, they are again approaching their historic low prices. At the time of filming, you can get a Gen 3 or Gen 4 1TB NVMe SSD for as low as $52 in the US. And the more you buy, the more you save. 2TB Gen 3 and Gen 4 NVMe drives are just $94. That's 10% cheaper per terabyte, and it's the best price per terabyte of any capacity. 4TB Gen 3 and Gen 4 drives, which last year were the best value, are still competitive, starting around $200. 8TB drives exist, but they're still silly price, and they start around $630 US. And I do not recommend Gen 5 NVMe SSDs, both because they run ridiculously hot and they provide no gaming performance benefit, but most of all, they are twice as costly as a Gen 3 or Gen 4 NVMe SSD for the same capacity. If you want to spend more money, my recommendation, invest in a better CPU, GPU, motherboard, cooler, literally anything else. Heck, just double the amount of storage and go Gen 3 or Gen 4. Stop buying bad PC cases. Let's get you the best PC case 2025 for your budget. So how much should you spend on your PC case in 2025? Well, I recommend spending 5 to 10% of your overall PC budget on the case, including any additional fans. That's going to vary a little bit as the cheapest PC cases start around $50, with some of the best budget PC cases around $60 to $70. Mid-range PC cases start around $80, and I would consider anything over $110 a premium PC case, and those go up into the hundreds of dollars depending what you're looking for. What size of PC case do you need? Well, PC cases are classified by what type of motherboard that they fit. ATX PC cases fit ATX sized and smaller motherboards, micro ATX sized PC cases fit micro ATX and smaller motherboards, and mini ITX PC cases, they only fit mini ITX motherboards. Now the physical dimensions of the case itself will vary, so double check that your components, particularly the GPU length, will fit in your case. In terms of styles, while traditional front intake PC cases like the Corsair 4000D and Bitphoenix Nova Mesh remain popular, atrium style PC cases now dominate the market, like the Thermaltake View series and the Antec C3 and the Antec C5, along with the Montec King 95. So how much airflow do you need in your PC case in 2025? Well, it depends on your components. I recommend at least 2 intake fans and 1 exhaust fan. Now, as we go up in power usage and higher end components, we definitely want to make sure to scale our airflow to match. I also generally recommend a slight positive pressure. That's where more air is pushed into the case than exhausted out, as that can help us control the amount of dust getting into the case at the intake points, either through mesh or filters. Remember, you don't need mesh filters at the exhaust ports, just where the air is coming into the build. PC case fans still vary widely in terms of their quality in 2025. Thankfully, only the worst budget PC cases use those uncontrollable Molex fans any longer. In fact, in 2025, many cases come with built-in fans and even ARGB hubs, where you can connect all the case fans to a single fan hub on your motherboard. You can also buy your own PWM and ARGB fan controller hubs and your own fans, so I will leave some link down in the video description, including a cheap 3-pack of Thermalright PWM ARGB fans that I really love that come in black or white. Most importantly, let's talk about your graphics card. There are 2 ways to mount your graphics card. versus the traditional horizontal mount, which does increase the risk of GPU sag. There are a number of ways to fix this, either through a stand mount or a bracket that bolts onto your PC. Just make sure it doesn't prevent one of the GPU fans from spinning. Or you can vertically mount the GPU. Just make sure your case will support this orientation and that there will be at least 1 inch of clearance between the glass and the GPU fans for proper airflow. You'll also need a PCIe riser cable to connect your GPU to the motherboard, and they come in different lengths and speeds. If you're having issue with a vertically mounted GPU using a PCIe riser cable, jump into the BIOS and then manually set the motherboard GPU slot PCIe speed to match the riser cable's rated speed, rather than using the auto setting. In terms of other features, modern cases generally offer front panel I/O with at least 2 USB 3.0 Type A ports, audio jacks, with some providing USB-C connectivity. Internal DVD drives, they're just not a thing anymore, so I'll link a cheap external USB connection DVD drive in the video description. Quality cases feature good cable management solutions, including rubber grommets and PSU shrouds for clean builds. Removable 3.5-inch hard drive bays are a plus, allowing for better cable management and sometimes airflow after you take them out. Remember, we have all of the full guides for each component linked down in the video description, along with our how to build a PC guide and how to set up your PC after you build, and those individual CPU build guides as well. If you got value out of this video, please give it a like. It makes a huge difference to the channel, and of course subscribe for more cool PC content like our how to build a PC guide right here. We walk you step by step to fully assemble your PC. It's easy if you do it right, so check out this video and we'll catch you on the next one.